Hello and welcome to an introduction to GRAD, GRAD being GraphQL and React implemented with Apollo and Django. Specifically, you have django-graphene handling the backend with GraphQL and then Apollo linking things into React. There are other acronyms that could be chosen for this. RAD, G, if you wanted to organize things a little bit more logically. You could make it drag if you want to be a little bit more insulting. I'm just choosing GRAD because I think it's simplistic, easy to remember. And really, I wanted to evangelize this particular stack. I find it very simplistic, easy to work with. I came across it because I'm a full stack engineer. I wear a lot of hats, and my primary responsibility isn't even development. And as a result, I found that I needed to pick up and drop development quite often. I have a lot of pickup tasks, had to deal with a lot of issues and fires here and there. And as a result, I really needed a simple system that I could work with where I could drop things, pick things back up, and still be productive with my development. And I feel like I really found that with this particular infrastructure. So I wanted to evangelize it that way and also promote it to see if I can get some additional help for the open source project I'm working on, which will be covered in a different video. So first of all, let's talk about the use cases for GRAD. I would argue that it is useful for small and medium-sized applications and proof of concepts in particular. It might be useful for large applications, but I have not done any metric measurement to be able to prove that. Logic says that usually when you have Python on the back end, you can get something more performant with, say, Go or Rust or something along those lines. But one nice thing about this infrastructure is if you want to get a proof of concept up, you can very rapidly get a proof of concept up and built and then switch out the back end with a different GraphQL solution if you want to. Additionally, I think it's just great for a fast development process. So if you need a fast development process, I really highly recommend using this particular stack. And then, of course, if you need a simplified development workflow, if you have a lot of moving parts and you just need things to be somewhat simpler, either on the front end or the back end, where it's clear, easy to document, easy to maintain, I would also recommend taking a look at this particular use case in this stack. There are limitations, of course, to the GRAD infrastructure. The big one I have run into is there's an issue with CSRF token verification as of this moment. This actually might not be the case. They might have updated this and fixed this with the latest version of Graphene. I haven't been able to look back and check. If they have, let me know and I'll update this video. But at this stage, the problem I have run into is that Django, with its CSRF token creation, it's expecting one token requested and then one token back on the front end. Unfortunately, with React, you end up with a lot of components, and so you end up with a lot of CSRF tokens being generated. And because React is asynchronous, sometimes you end up with a reply from the server where it all lines up, but sometimes you don't, at which point you get a CSRF token verification error. And again, I hope they're working on solving this. I expect it to be solved in the near future. If it is, I will update this video. If not, let me know. Also, addendum, if you guys have run into other big issues regarding this, let me know and I'll update it in this limitation section. And then the other big one I've run into is there is limitations to the documentation, and this is being created on the 29th of January, so this might have hopefully updated since then, but there's not a huge amount of Stack Overflow examples, particularly for the graphene section. Django-graphene. You can still grab examples from the Django model creation. There's still examples from React, but these are newer technologies, so there's just fewer examples in Stack Overflow for particular use cases for GraphQL implementations and also for Django-graphene. But honestly, because of the simplicity of this entire architecture, I haven't found that I've needed to turn to Stack Overflow all that often. One of the things I did have to turn to Stack Overflow for was the CSRF token verification issue I mentioned up above, and for that I actually ended up having to go to the GitHub issues page. Also, on a side note, I really want to sing the praises of the entire Django-graphene team. I highly recommend supporting them in particular, either financially or through open source work. So, arguments for GRAD. It is dead simple. I really think that this front-end development process is just really straightforward, really easy. I really recommend checking it out. It allows for fast modeling and flexible schema with Django-graphene. So essentially, if you have a data idea that you want to get out and get into a GraphQL endpoint as rapidly as possible, it lets you get there pretty quickly. Django modeling is really simplistic, and piping it into Django-graphene to get that GraphQL endpoint is a breeze in most instances. I think this is the strongest point out of anything, whether you're using Django-graphene as your backend or not, is GraphQL simplifies and accelerates React development. One of the big headaches in React development is dealing with the component lifecycle portions, which typically are, and that's the will component mount, will component dismount, will component, all those sort of things there. And really the problem with the headache of React is that you're dealing with two concepts of data. You've got data that's coming from the back end that you want to display on the front end, and then you have your state, which is usually handled through the state, this.state, within React itself. And keeping those two portions of the data clear can be somewhat frustrating at times and really creates the headache, and that also introduces the necessity for things like Redux and MobX. With GraphQL, I have not seen the need for Redux or MobX yet. It's possible that there's a use case out there where it is necessary. I haven't run into it. And honestly, GraphQL, it's fantastic because, particularly with Apollo, you don't have to worry about the state of your data, whether it's loading, whether it needs to be refetched or something along those lines. And that takes a lot of the headache out of the React development process. And honestly, a lot of the state internal to the React components is handled through React itself. So it really simplifies React development, and I really want to emphasize that point. Additionally, this is what I've found to be the use case, which is why I've kind of dove into this stack to begin with, is it's really easy to start, stop, and return to development. Because it's really easy to componentize things, because it's really easy to know, basically look at schema, look at your model, basically see where you left off. It's easy to start and stop. That's not to say I don't have code duplication or any problems, but I think it's been greatly reduced because I've been in this architecture. And additionally, it's easy, as I kind of alluded to, it's easy to separate concerns. You know what's in your UI and what's being handled by your UI. You know what's being handled in your data model. And if it's, as a result, it's very easy to put logic in its proper context. And it's also easy to identify where logic can be handled in both portions and therefore make, I think, better decisions regarding where you're going to put your logic. So with all of that in mind, let's take a quick 10,000-foot view of what it looks like. So on the back end, you can pretty much use any database that's compatible with Django, which I'm pretty sure is all of them at this stage. I personally use Postgres just because, or PostgreSQL, mostly because I really enjoy using Postgres and find it to be very flexible. It also adds a little bit of additional functionality into Django that's very particular to Postgres. For the data modeling, that is getting your database objects into a Python model object, I use Django, of course. Some people complain about the ORM, but I find the ORM to be really simple and straightforward. And of course, you can replace this portion with anything you want, but you'll probably have to end up using a different GraphQL implementation. I know there's some individuals that will pipe it directly to GraphQL straight from SQL. I'm not sure I would recommend that process. But anyway, from there, once you have it in a Django model, you can put it directly into a schema using Graphene Django, which again, check out that library. It's fantastic. And really, it's a super fast process to get a GraphQL endpoint. And with the schema, you can even create mock data to pipe things out if you just want to get people working on the UI with something that's non-existent in a database. I really find it to be a pleasure to work with. Once you have that GraphQL endpoint from the back end, you can pipe data into Apollo Client. And from Apollo Client, essentially that's to get the data into React from GraphQL. There's two ways of handling it within Apollo. You can either use their built-in query components or data components. And essentially what that's doing is that's taking the GraphQL data and creating essentially a React component that you can then wrap other components in kind of a standard HTML hierarchical view. I actually prefer the higher order component method, which is essentially taking a higher order component, wrapping your original React component. And what that does is that adds data directly to the props of your React app. And then you can deal with it there. And it's really nice and consistent. You always end up with an error state, a loading state, or essentially the data being available. So you just need to handle your error case, your loading case, and then do whatever you want with the data after that. And then once you're in React, again, it becomes very easy when you don't have to worry about what's happening with your data as far as it shooting back from the back end or not, and what state it's in that regard. You just have to worry about your internal state to your app, so it lets you create those beautiful web applications pretty rapidly. So if you want to learn more, this is the tutorial series, kind of taking a view on each of these components and how to get up and going pretty rapidly. And at the end of this, of course, I'm looking for people to join me in working on an open source project, which I'll discuss in another video. So I hope you guys get a clear view of what GRAD is and kind of the basics of what it looks like overall. And if you're more interested, please continue with this video series.